Hi everyone, I hope you are all doing well. I hope you enjoyed our nature lecture last week and the Where Do the Children Play video. I'm going to be reviewing your discussion post, so stay tuned for that and I'll provide my feedback. In today's lecture, we're going to be focusing on disabilities. This is our first lecture in the Play and Special Populations section, and then we will also have gender and culture. Just a reminder that you do have your child observation report due this weekend, 10/29 at 11:59 p.m. So just keep that in mind as you're going about your week. And let's get into today's lecture. Okay, so to get us started, I just wanted to share with you some incidence rates and talk a little bit about IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. So this is just some information to give you an idea of what IDEA looks like. Basically, IDEA is a service providing rights to children with disabilities, and they provide access to free and appropriate education services for infants, toddlers, and youth ages birth to 21. So infants and toddlers are part of IDEA Part C, so birth to 2 years old, and specifically helping families in this area of IDEA, and they have early intervention services, speech therapy and home visits, as well as occupational therapy. And then within IDEA Part C, children are eligible to receive IFSPs while they're in school, so individualized family service plans, and the main focus is just to look at children's level of development and also help families to establish goals. And in IDEA Part B, this area serves children 3 years old to 21 years old, and the main area is for special education services, and children within the school settings can have IEPs, also known as individualized education plans, where they also focus on children's development and help children to develop goals. And just to give you some statistics, in 2021, 66% of children with disabilities were in general education classrooms for more than 80% of their school day. And also in 2021-2022, about 15%, so 7.3 million children ages 3 to 21 were served by IDEA. And unfortunately, during COVID, this percentage dropped by 1%. But just to give you an idea on a typical basis without COVID playing a factor, 15% of children are receiving services, and children with disabilities often need additional support and services set in place in order to be able to meet their learning and daily needs. And so just wanted to give you kind of some information to get us started. All right, so let's start off with children with physical impairments. So we're going to be going into different sections and talking about different areas where children might have disabilities and or delays. And a lot of the areas that we're going to discuss sometimes overlap depending on the type of disability or if children have multiple disabilities. So you'll start to see a trend as we're discussing how different disabilities impact children's play. But to get us started with physical impairments, children with physical impairments have impacts in their play related to their gross motor skills. So for instance, we think about a child's ability to throw a ball or play tag with a group of friends. They might not be able to do this due to lack of movement in their torso, their legs, their arms. A child might be in a wheelchair. And I just want you to kind of think about the amount of time you spend in day-to-day tasks that require you to engage in physical ways, such as bending down to pick something up, lifting up your arms to get dressed, turning your torso, or walking from point A to point B when you reach out for objects or pick things up. So we're using our bodies, specifically our gross motor skills, constantly throughout the day, and children have conditions where this is impacted, and This also impacts their social interactions because they might not be able to run after their friends on the playground and play tag or keep up in a game of catch because they don't have the ability to grasp onto objects. And as I mentioned at the beginning, we may see children who have physical impairments paired with something else. So, for example, children who have cerebral palsy, my apologies, they might have difficulties in motor abilities and in speech abilities, so their social interactions would also be impacted in that way. And we see for children who are delayed physically or have permanent differences than their same aged peers, they have different amounts of movement and strengths and challenges. And so we think about how much children might need support from an adult in order to integrate themselves and to be able to play more easily in a group with children their age or similar ages. And so we think about activities that we want children to engage in depending on the age that they're at. And when we have children who have physical impairments, they might not be able to participate in the jumping through the hula hoops or the obstacle course that we've proposed for children. As much as we would love them to, their physical impairments are limiting them from this social interaction. And so as adults in the classroom or teachers or parents, we have to think about ways where children with physical impairments can still be included in this. And I've put up a picture here of a typical classroom, elementary, middle school that you might see, and just looking at how accessibility to play materials and equipment and proper positioning is impacted for children with physical impairments. So their ability to move about the classroom is already limited if the classroom is not accessible to them. So, for example, maybe most of the children in the classroom are able to reach to the center of the table to grab the art materials such as the scissors and the glue and the pencils and crayons. But a child who has a physical impairment, maybe they aren't able to reach their arm out to the center of the table and they can only move their wrist up and down. And so they're going to need materials closer to them at the table. Or if they have a wheelchair, they aren't able to sit at the desk right next to their peer because the desk is either too high or too short. Their wheelchair doesn't fit. So there's many different reasons why we want to make sure classroom materials and equipment are accessible for children in their play spaces. And that also goes for our outdoor spaces as well, and we'll talk about that in a little bit later on. But really, we want to make sure that children have accessibility, and thinking about different types of classrooms, accessibility might look slightly different because, for example, in an infant and toddler classroom, a child who might have a physical impairment may not be at a different pace than their peers in the classroom because in a young infant classroom, not everybody is walking yet. And so the types of areas in the classroom may already be set up to accommodate for a child who has physical impairments. And so we won't see the need for adapted play materials and equipment until the child is in an older toddler preschool classroom where their abilities are now different or at a lower rate or permanent in comparison to their peers. And so really we're thinking about how do we adapt the environment to meet the needs of children at different age groups in different types of classrooms. Do we need to move furniture around so that children can move about the classroom? Do children have difficulty holding on to objects, and do we need to adapt their items for them? So do we have tongs that children can use to grasp onto objects, or do we need to do hand over hand or bring materials closer for children to be able to grasp onto? So it really depends on the child and what they might need. Same with access to proper positioning equipment. Do children need seat supports, raised desks and chairs? Do they need additional equipment to support them with feeding, art and writing, moving from point A to point B? Are children able to sit in a chair with proper positioning, and then once they need to be moving around the classroom, they would be placed back in their wheelchair? So really just thinking about how physical impairments are impacted in interactions that children might have, and their accessibility in the classroom is often limited. And due to the fact that many children are not in standardized classrooms and inclusion isn't as practiced in some classrooms, we may not see accessibility. So when I was in elementary school, the way that my school buildings were set up, we had trailers, and so there were ramps that you went to get up to, but imagine it was just steps to get up to the classroom. And so how would a child who has a physical impairment effectively get into the classroom, or if they did have a wheelchair and the building was not accessible for them to be able to move in and out of? So just things to think about when designing classrooms and play materials that you have set up. Are they out of reach for children? Can children easily grasp onto them? Things like that. Next, we're going to be talking about children with sensory impairments, and there are 2 slides for this one, so we'll start here and then I will pause and move on to the next slide. So to start off, we're going to discuss children with sensory impairments in visual impairments and hearing impairments. And for visual impairments, we often see that children engage more in solitary play because they do have difficulty in picking up on nonverbal communication. The play signals that children are presenting are either inaccessible or limited for children who have visual impairments. So a child who is completely blind, they're not going to pick up on the nonverbal play signal that a child gives them, where they're smiling and pointing across the classroom, indicating that they're ready to move on to the next area. And they're not likely to imitate peers or others during play because they cannot see them. So they have an inability to pick up on nonverbal communication and be able to see what's going on in the classroom. So a child who may be nonverbal and a child who may be visually impaired, they might have difficulty in engaging with one another due to their individual impairments with language and sensory. And we also see that children who have visual impairments, they engage in less fantasy play and imaginative play because they have difficulty in representing objects. They're not able to see the object in front of them, and so being able to represent it in a higher form is difficult for them. Same with less manipulation of the environment. So children who have visual impairments, they need more familiar areas, and if they're in an area where they can play and stay there to play, they are more likely to be able to engage with the materials in their environment. And so if we have children who are constantly moving about the classroom from one area to another, it might be harder for someone who has a visual impairment to keep up because they're still in the first area, feeling the materials and using their other senses in order to explore the environment. And there's lower construction and lower construction and exploratory play in the sense that children are using their other senses in order to be able to grasp a hold of what is this that I'm touching? How am I going to be manipulating this? And so having an adult be there to explain what a child might be feeling. So describing in detail, right now you are holding a ball that is smooth, and when you squeeze it, it is squeaky. And here I'm going to be handing you a ball that is lumpy and bumpy. And when you smell it, this ball smells like plastic. So giving them really descriptive language on how they can understand their world in different ways through different types of senses when they are visually impaired. And this also goes for children who have hearing difficulties, giving them opportunities to explore the world using their other senses. And children who have hearing difficulties are also less likely to engage in sociodramatic play because they have difficulty engaging in verbal communication during play. And we see that language is a key element in sociodramatic play. Children are starting to represent objects and starting to say what they want to be and engaging with others. I want to be a doctor. Okay, I'm going to be a nurse. All right, we're going to help the baby. And so language is flourishing during this time. And so somebody who has a hearing difficulty or impairment is less likely to be able to engage with children who have language and are able to hear. And so we see decreased language in children who have hearing difficulties. Now, this does not mean that there is no sociodramatic play and that children are unable to engage in sociodramatic play. But if you have children in a classroom who are not using sign language in order to communicate with somebody who has a hearing difficulty, so if we're not using nonverbal communication for our hearing friends, and we are not using verbal communication for our visually impaired friends, we're going to have a difficult time in communicating with them and being able to interact during play. And we also see less object substitution for children who have hearing difficulties. So on the next slide, like I said, I'm going to be going over more sensory impairments. Okay, so moving on to our second slide of sensory impairments. On this slide, I'm going to be focusing on sensory processing disorder. And really what sensory processing disorder is our senses on overdrive. And a child's brain is not able, or a person's brain is not able to fully process sensory stimuli, and this is within the 5 typical senses, so sight, sound, hearing, taste, touch, and smell. And I think I said more than one. I counted 6 on my finger, but sights, I said sense. Sense would be the 6th and 7th. So the body awareness of proprioception and the movement of vestibular. So really there's about 6 to 7 senses, but the 5 main senses are in overdrive, and so are the internal senses. So the proprioception and the vestibular with our body awareness and movement. Really what sensory processing disorder is that children have an overdrive of their senses. So we might see children who are more likely to be aware of itchy clothes, loud noises, when water touches their face, when foods have textures that they dislike, and this can lead to tantrums and dramatic mood swings. And really children are trying to self-regulate, but their fight or flight response is either turned all the way up or turned all the way down. And so if water touches a child's face and they have a sensory processing disorder, it might lead to them screaming and running off. Whereas a child who doesn't have a sensory processing disorder, they're easily able to wipe the water away, clean their faces. It may cause them a moment of distress, but an extended period of distress and overwhelming feelings and emotions is not likely. And when children have sensory processing disorders, it impacts their play because they have delayed levels of play, particularly complexity of social play. So they're not as likely to have cooperation in their play or symbolism in their play, and they have decreased durations of time when engaging with toys and objects, so their persistence in play is lower. And we also see that children who have sensory processing disorders prefer toys that satisfy their sensory needs. And so I have here as the image a child who has on noise canceling headphones, and so they're able to cut out some of that stimuli that's causing them overwhelming feelings and distress. And I've included here a couple links for you to check out. So the first one is a sensory checklist, and this just kind of gives you an idea of what a child might display if they are if they are experiencing sensory processing disorder. So this checklist gives you an idea of if a child is sensitive to different textures of food, and you can click and see, all the time, sometimes, or not really. So it's just a checklist to kind of give you an idea of where your child or a child might be at and if they do qualify for a sensory processing disorder. And then the second link that I have for you here is a sensory processing disorder occupational therapy demonstration. And so you can see the occupational therapist you can see the occupational therapist is demonstrating what she does in her work with a child who has a sensory processing disorder. And the video shows a start with putting on weighted ankle and wrist bracelets, and how that's the beginning of their session in order to help the child to regulate and have control over their internal stimuli, so their body awareness and their movement. Like I said, again, body awareness is proprioception and movement is vestibular. And then they go on to do different types of activities that support this child's specific sensory processing needs. And you'll see them doing activities where the child is working on moving their torso and working on reaching for objects, working on their balance. So different elements specifically that they're focusing on for this child and their sensory needs. And then they close out the session with the child engaging in calming activities, turning down the lights, decompressing a bit after they've had busy and active play. Alrighty, so now let's talk about children with cognitive impairments. And I didn't mention it on the previous slide, but when you're clicking on the sensory checklist, make sure that you click open hyperlink. Sometimes the links that I provide, you can click directly on it and it will take you there, but for the ones on that previous slide, you're going to have to click open hyperlink once you've opened the lecture in PowerPoint. So like I said, this slide is going to be children with cognitive impairments, so let's discuss. So cognitive impairments may be affected from biological or environmental factors. So a child with biological factors could be someone with Down syndrome, and a child who's impacted cognitively from the environment could be a child who has fetal alcohol syndrome or who has experienced a traumatic brain injury. And we see children who have cognitive impairments are slower in their behaviors and language development, and really they are neurobiological disorders, and they affect children's executive functioning, such as their memory, their decision making, being able to process information and understand what they're receiving when people are talking or showing them things. Executive functioning also relates to problem solving, cognitive flexibility, so someone's ability to be able to adjust quickly to changes in their environment or stimuli that they are processing. And really, a cognitive impairment impacts a child's ability to think and learn. And this looks different depending on the severity of one's cognitive impairment, and so we'll see difficulties in day-to-day living and activities. And some children have other forms of cognitive impairment such as ADHD and ADD, so attention deficit disorders, and OCD, and also sensory processing disorder can be connected to a cognitive impairment in a child's ability to think and learn. And so we see that cognitive impairments impact both object play and symbolic play, and children prefer more structured materials because somebody who has a cognitive impairment is lacking in their ability to process information, problem solve, and when children are presented with more open-ended materials, it requires them to think more abstractly and think more creatively. And if children are impacted in their thinking and their abilities to function with processing information, having structured materials is going to be more beneficial for them, because a structured material gives them more of a map of how to engage with the material and how to solve the problem, because they are limited in that area of problem solving and thinking. And we see less constructive play and more exploration with materials, which we talked about in previous lectures of what exploration looks like in comparison to construction of materials. And we see with symbolic play that mental age is a better predictor than chronological age. So we might not be at the same developmental level as a child who has a cognitive impairment versus someone who doesn't. We may see differences in their developmental levels. So for example, a child who is chronologically age 3 might be mentally at the age of a 1-year-old. And so their abilities, even though they are 3 years old and they look 3 years old and they are physically built like a 3-year-old, they may not have the language skills and the cooperation skills, the turn-taking skills, the ability to problem solve at the level of a 3-year-old. And so children who are placed in classrooms with diverse age groups, we may see differences in their abilities to play because they're not able to represent objects if their mental age is lower than their chronological age. Alrighty, so now we're going to talk about children with communication disorders. So really this is children who have delayed language, and oftentimes we see children who have autism. They are struggling with communication, and I wanted to preface by saying that autism is both cognitive and neurobiological, as well as impacting communication. But really, delayed language impacts children because they have diminished sociodramatic play, so they have difficulty in expressing their emotions and their feelings because they do not have the language of somebody who can say, I'm feeling frustrated right now and I don't want to play anymore. And so instead of being able to express themselves through words, they are more likely to use violence and unable to communicate their wants and needs. And so this also impacts their abilities in being able to insert themselves into play groups. And we see that children with delayed language often interact more with adults or other children who have similar language patterns to them, as well as engage in object substitution less often. And children who have autism or on the autism spectrum, because autism is a spectrum disorder, they're typically able to be diagnosed around the age of 2 to 3, and we see that boys are about 4 times more likely than girls to be on the spectrum for autism. And children who have autism or autism spectrum disorder are typically lacking social skills, they're delayed in language, or they could be nonverbal, and they have limited interests and a harder time understanding others' feelings. And so we see that there is a lack of eye contact and a lack of being able to interact with others due to their lack of understanding for others' feelings. So if somebody is upset that they took their toy, they might not have the ability to be able to understand, oh, okay, this is why I feel empathetic towards this person. And an autism spectrum disorder could be combined with additional mental or behavioral disorders. And some behaviors that we see are repetitive and restricted stereotyped manipulation of objects, such as spinning or lining up toys. And this type of play excludes other children oftentimes. So on your exam, we saw the example of a child who was moving a car back and forth on the floor, not engaging with anyone else. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that they have autism, but this could be a behavior of a child who has autism due to their restricted, repetitive, stereotype manipulation of the object, and they're unaware of the social cues and invitations for play, and so this might be why it's harder for them to interact with others. And they also could be experiencing similar impairments to someone who has a sensory processing disorder, in the sense that they have sensory avoidance or sensory overload. So they have increased movements or stimming, which is the repetitive movements of objects and their own bodies, such as flapping or jumping, spinning, hitting. And often children who have sensory avoidance or overload, they may cover their eyes and ears, shut down or melt down. So kind of similar to sensory processing in the sense that it's just too much sensory and they're unable to process the stimuli. And children who have autism typically have little use of objects symbolically. And there's a debate on whether or not children are able to engage in symbolic play due to a symbolic deficit, or there's a connotative hypothesis that looks at a child's brain who is autistic and whether or not they're able to think in symbols, or if they just don't care, not in the sense that have an inability to not care, but their social deficits limit them in their interest in this type of play. So they don't have as much interest in being able to play with others, and they don't have as much interest in a variety of different types of object play. So like I said, they're engaging in more restrictive and repetitive types of movements with objects in their body. So they're lining up the cars repeatedly over and over and over again, or they're wanting to just constantly spin a ball in a circle instead of wanting to roll a ball down a ramp and knock over blocks. Instead, they are engaging in different types of play than other children, and so they're not engaging in as much symbolic play. So again, it's kind of up to you and what you think based on the research out there, but just something to kind of think about for why children have little use of objects symbolically, whether it's that symbolic deficit or connotative hypothesis of they just don't care or have interest in this type of play. And then lastly, we see impediments to social interaction. So like I said, children with autism are experiencing lack of language skills and might even be nonverbal, and they have less shared attention and interest, kind of looking at that connotative hypothesis. So are they really unable to think in symbols, or do they just not have any interest in this type of play? And really, as an adult, our goal is to help children in these areas, and we can be a co-play, to their social play. So providing children with context in their play and allowing them opportunities to play within their interests. So what do they like to do? I remember I was at the park when I was a nanny, and I used to nanny for 3 little girls at the time. The youngest was 2, middle was 5, and oldest was 8. And we went to the park one day, and there was a little boy there, and he was hanging out with his grandma, and so we were chatting for a little bit, and he was fascinated with the sprinklers and knew everything under the sun about the sprinklers, and this was his interest. And he was not interested in going off to play on the playground or talking about, playing tag or going off to play what the children I was nannying with. He was interested and fascinated with the sprinklers, how the sprinklers worked, the gizmos, gadgets, and gears, and really just studying and watching the sprinklers move up and down and spin and spray the grass with the water. And so this was this child's focus, and they had a repetitive manipulation of the object of the sprinkler, and so they were not engaging in the same way as the children that I was nannying with and other children on the playground. And so just an example of something that you might witness. And so children are kind of in their own world, doing their own thing. And so if you can insert yourself into their play based on their interests, you're likely to build a connection with them. And this goes for any child with any disability, or just looking at children in general, really figuring out what are they interested in and what areas are they different in their play skills and social interactions with others, and how can we best support them to meet their needs. Alrighty, so this is just an extension from the previous slide when we were looking at autism spectrum disorder. And so here's an example of a way that you might support a child because of their limited language or lack of language skills, potentially being nonverbal. And as we know, children with autism spectrum disorder, they may struggle with verbal information, but they may be good with visuals. And so we can pair verbal input with visual supports. And so some ways that we might do this are putting together picture books, and I've included an example here of the activities section in a child's speech and language picture book. And so you see here that in the picture books, we might have pictures of various classroom activities that can be carried throughout the day, such as lunch and play, indoor and outdoor, specific activities that pertain to the child's interests. So on this card, you see that there's 4 main activities, and it looks like they can remove them and swap them out depending on what the child's interests are. So we have drawing, slide, water play, and scooter. And then there are key pictures of conversational items surrounding the main activity. So this is related to the child's feelings, interests, and desires. So I and me, I want to more, I don't want to, I like or I dislike, I feel this way. And this could also include favorite people, favorite items, action words. So a child may point to the I, me picture, and then they point to the want and need picture, and then they point to the slide. And so that's a way of the child communicating with their teacher that they want to go on the slide. And then the teacher might repeat and say, okay, do you want to go on the slide? And then they maybe come down here to the bottom and they point to the yes, or maybe they point to the no. And then the teacher says, okay, you do not want to go on the slide. Where do you want to go? And maybe they point to, I want / need, and they actually meant to put scooter, or they point to the slide again, and maybe we realize, okay, they don't want the slide, but they want something outside. And so we say, do you want to go outside? And so we're able to pick up on what the child's trying to communicate with us through pictures. Okay, last but not least, these are just some additional reasons why children who have disabilities might experience play differences. And a big one that we see are in a big thing that we see is in classrooms and playgrounds. And so I mentioned at the beginning of our lecture that we would resurface the topic of classrooms and playgrounds and their accessibility. But really, we're seeing that classrooms and playgrounds are not designed for children with special needs, specifically children with physical impairments, and they have limited or no access to move around. So again, thinking about a child who is in a wheelchair, how are they going to get to the top of the slide in their wheelchair if there is no ramp for them? Or a child who has lower ability to control their torso and balance, how are they going to walk along uneven surfaces on the playground? And so we really just think about the design of our spaces and how they need to be accessible for everyone. And so I've included a video here. And again, make sure that you click download this in PowerPoint, and then you'll click hyperlink. So you'll do a left click, click hyperlink, and then click open hyperlink, and it will take you to pbs.org, and you'll be able to see a video paired with a article talking about a playground for everyone, no matter what your age. And so a mom describes her experience with having a child who was not able to play on the typical playground due to her disabilities, and how she created a playground for everyone. And so just to give you kind of an example, and again, this is just here in our local areas, but there's so many different playgrounds that allow accessibility in different parts of the United States. And so feel free to poke around and kind of see what speaks to you. This is just one example. We also see that children with disabilities are often served in segregated settings, and adaptive technology is not embedded into daily classrooms. And so we're seeing that classrooms are not set up for children who have disabilities. So I want you to kind of just think about, it's not just the computers, but the toys and the equipment. Some of the ways that we adapt our classroom settings with technology is simply by having video captioning and control switches on toys for children who are not able to grasp onto them. But children with disabilities, like I said, are often served in segregated areas due to their disabilities may be more severe, or we just don't have spaces that are set up for varying disabilities. And as we've seen in our previous lecture slides, not every disability is visible. And even though we want to have more inclusive classrooms, we don't have enough resources, and there's not enough education surrounding inclusivity in classrooms. And really what we want to do is have inclusivity as much as we can. And adults often intrude on play with children with special needs, and sometimes we don't even realize that we're doing it, and we limit children when we could just create spaces that allow them to play on their own and work on the skills that we know that they already can accomplish, and give them opportunities to play with others, even though we may see, okay, they have differences, and that's okay. And so teaching and creating cultures in not only school settings, but just in general around play differences, and that we're all different, and that's part of being human. And so having materials in the classroom and pictures and books in the classroom that allow children to see, wow, there's a variety of different people in the world, and they may think, look, feel, and behave differently than me. This is kind of the goal as a teacher. And just another resource for you here. This is a, excuse me, this is a resource for child care centers, schools, families, teachers to directly support children and provide trainings, consultations, evaluations, sensory and movement spaces, as well as mindfulness, wellness spaces. And they're called Mindfulness in Motion, and the OT is specifically CAPS for occupational therapy. And so this specific resource is local to our CSUSB, and we're using them in our childcare centers at our CSUSB campus to help children in the classroom who are potentially experiencing disabilities and need support in self-regulation and life productivity and behavioral support. And so just wanted to give you an additional resource of something that is potentially local to you, so you can check that out. And this is the last slide that I have for you all today. I hope you enjoyed today's lecture, and we will be continuing our lectures on our play in special, play in special populations with our culture and our gender lectures to come. So I will talk to you all in our next lecture. Bye, everyone.